Yeah, should I use this or
as you like. I think it's...
Let's see. Yeah. So welcome. I was already introduced. My name is Laura Kmoch, and I'm now in the final year of my PhD studies already, for good or scary reasons. And I'm based at Chalmers University in the Division of Physical Resource Theory. And what you see here is not Gothenburg and not Chalmers University. That's Tidim. It's a town in Myanmar, in the uplands of Myanmar, in northern Chin State. You can imagine sort of behind those hills, there's another 3 or 4 rows of hills, and then comes India, just to sort of position us somewhere. And this is one of 2 field sites where I've been doing my work for the PhD. This is the other field site. This is in Chan State, so if you know something about Myanmar, imagine more towards Thailand in that direction, but sort of in the center of the country. So it's 2 different field sites, both in the mountain, but in a little bit different sort of settings, and different ethnic groups also who sort of live in these environments. And now I put this question quite simple, what brings us here? Because I thought I'd just give you a very brief introduction of what's my PhD about overall. And what brought me here to this landscape was really an interest in the link between livelihoods, and the people now here are very small, but that's the people whose livelihoods I care about, and the landscapes they're living in. And the motivation or the rationale was that we thought, okay, Myanmar is in a time of sort of opening up after decades of military rule. The military actually still sort of rules, but there's a lot of change happening in the country. And the idea was that this change will also influence how people and livelihoods interact and, I guess, codepend and shape each other. And I was interested in understanding more about that. So one question I asked in the first paper I worked with was about rural livelihoods and their ties to the landscape in terms of income streams. So how dependent are rural people really with their livelihoods on the land? That's that question. And then I'm interested in the land use practices, because of course you're not going to realize any income streams or any benefit from land without actively working on that land. And in the paper I'm working on now, sort of a follow-up, working with the same data, I'm looking at the customary tenure systems, so that I can also say something about which type of land use practices do people engage in, how does it have to do with the tenure system that sort of is a layer on top of the land use, and how does that feed back to the livelihoods. And what I'm going to do in the coming papers, and I already collected the data for this, is to look more at questions of climate vulnerability of those people and how that's tied to land and processes on the land, and what the possible adaptation strategies are there really. And I've done that by working with 2 NGOs who do like climate resilience adaptation programs in the country, and trying to interview farmers who are part of farmer field schools in Myanmar about their experiences with those programs. So this is sort of the questions I've been posing to the people and in turn to the landscapes where I've been working on. And then I sort of used this path to just illustrate there's something here about a development that's unknown. And of course, without looking into the future and looking at different time steps, I'm doing sort of snapshot studies in the villages. I'm interested in thinking about, okay, what does this mean where we are now for where livelihoods will go in Myanmar and where land use will go. And why does this matter then? To me, it matters because I'm really interested in how this development of livelihoods and land can somehow be influenced or steered in Myanmar, not by me, but by the NGOs who work there, by the government. And so what I found in the first paper that I wrote, where I looked at livelihoods, I found that as much as this landscape looks like a farming landscape, you can see swidden fields here. And if you go in the villages and ask people what they do, they will say we're farmers. But actually remittances and wage labor play a really big role here. It's the biggest share of the economy in the villages where I worked, came from remittances sent from young people who have left the family and now send money back. So from Singapore, the US, or so on. And if we don't know that, then doing an intervention in the country will miss that big aspects of people's livelihoods. Another thing that I found was that especially the most poor people in the communities I studied still very much depend on land. So it's also not true to say it's all about wage and labor. And what I find now is that the access to this land, so who can actually use which fields and so on, is unequal even under the customary systems. And it's also insecure because most people don't have a title to their land, and the government is rolling out a program to codify, I guess, the land use, and not based on the customary rules, but based on sort of a new system. Yeah, and then I just ask what's next. Farming system challenges, extreme weather events, and these farmer field schools I talk about. So that's the data I will work with in the coming year. And if you find this interesting, please talk to me.
Yes, there's a coffee break after this session. Thank you, Laura.
Okay, so this was a very good start for me because I'm going to talk about one aspect of remittances. Perhaps you have seen the photos of this girl who sent her last message to her parents from a truck in the UK the moments before she died. And she was on the way from Vietnam. She sent the message to her mother on her WhatsApp saying, I can't breathe, I'm going to die, and I'm sorry. Why was she sorry? Well, she put her family in debt. And she is not alone. She is one of 33 million young Vietnamese below 25 years old in Vietnam. It's 1/3 of the population. So a lot of them come from the countryside. And what did she leave? We've been working on remittances and how it's used and migration in this part of the world where she comes from, in central Vietnam, for quite some years. And we've discovered that there are four typologies. We sort of came up with four typologies of people where the goal of going away to work is to exit agriculture. So I don't know if there is here. That's your main goal, because who wants to be a farmer? And some of them go away, like she tried to go first from Japan to make more money to bring her to UK to work. So if you come back and you have a lot of money, you can invest that in a little shop, or you can do something to keep staying in the village but get your income from something else. What happens when you don't get that much money? So that would be to invest in your farm. We work a lot with those people because they are the ones who would invest in something that saves labor. Many times that would be to invest in trees, monoculture acacia, 4 years rotations for pulp. Other things, because this province, what media actually Guardian has brought up also is the context where they live in terms of climatic and natural hazards. This is in the central of Vietnam, where there are lots of typhoons, storms and drought in the spring. So it's very difficult to adjust your farming systems to all these type of extreme weather events. What they discovered 2 years ago was that when all the acacias broke after a typhoon, they looked at what survived. Well, it was the trees that were more like a shrub shape, tea plants, and then lower plants. This doesn't bring much money, though. So they want to invest in other things still as a side business. Many of them have a side job working for the government or working on the road construction. What girls in her age would do would be to go to Samsung factory, and when you're 35 years old, you're too old to work there and you have to go somewhere else. Sometimes you come back to your farm. Sometimes of the older people who migrate, it's short-term jobs in the country. They would go when somebody is ill, or they need money for education, or they need to pay for the children's weddings, for example. And sometimes, like in the case where her family probably will end up now, is where you use your farm as your last resort. Many of the people we have talked to have been on illegal contracts in Southeast Asia, lost the money, or they go on the 3-year contracts where after 1 year you broke your arm or something happened in the construction site, and you lost the money you invested. So to go at least $6,000, apparently she has paid $30,000 to go away and get a job. We don't have time to look at the videos now, but we have interviewed, farmers have made their own videos with people who live in the villages, and I would happily share these videos. They're on YouTube, so you can look at them later. Very interesting, actually, on what they how they think about things. So what else do? We work in a climate smart village in central Vietnam, where we're trying to identify, as I just mentioned here, different alternatives to these climatic disasters and stresses and changes that they face. And we also work with support to implement the Paris Agreement and participatory climate services. So this is how you can respond to the seasonal weather forecast and some other things that you will see here. Yes. And I'm happy to talk about this yes.
Hi. Yeah, hi, I'm Stephen again. Don't want to take up too much of your time since you've already heard from me today. But I realized when I'm talking about my PhD research that you could probably piece together what I've done from existing Focali information briefs, for example. So I feel like I have a lot to learn from you guys, and I'm going to be picking up lots of those briefs after this. So I'm basically looking into one particular type of nature-based solutions, or so they're called, and I'm focusing on ecosystem-based adaptation, which was one of those buzzwords that you mentioned. And I'm taking two case studies of EBA from Sri Lanka, which is where some of you have been doing your work in the past, right? So this will be a pleasure to talk to you about that soon. But basically, I'm an ecologist by background, but actually I think we need to look into these interventions. And I think we need to do that working with sociological analysis, particularly with issues of power. And so where do we see power? Well, to be honest, it's being made invisible, and it's being made increasingly invisible when we talk about nature-based solutions as something biophysical. And I would say that's the main claim of my PhD, or the main argument I'm trying to make, is that we're increasingly taking out the social processes of the intervention itself, and also the social context in which they're intervening. And that might not be news to many of you, but I think that nature-based or biophysical-based approaches increase that risk of ignoring issues of power. So that's what I think is the kind of key thing to get out now, is like, how do we bring people back into that picture? So I tried to understand these interventions through an empowerment lens, focusing on agency, for example, or subjectivities, again, stuff that's not coming up in these dominant representations of these projects. So I find we really need to question the logics of some of these projects, the cause and effect. And we need to look at the dominant modes in which they're being implemented, and the dominant frames in which they're being implemented as well. And again, this might not be news to many of you, but I mean, when you look at the discourses at the international level, this is obviously stuff where researchers need to take that critical distance and question some of these claims. And that's what I've tried to do. And we can do that as I mentioned before, that critical decade. Let's put people back in the picture. Let's put power back in the picture. Make the hidden visible, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. And also acknowledge many of these risks that are developing. The political economy of nature-based solutions, as Andrea mentioned. Also these burden shifting risks as well. And I just came from a conference on loss and damage, and I think there's plenty that we could look at in terms of adaptation limits, and also loss and damage to unique ecosystems, and feedbacks between ecological and social elements in landscapes as well. Thank you very much. Oh.
This is a collaborative project that involves a wide range of other researchers whose names I do not have time to tell you right now. But anyway, so what we're looking at is everyone in this room knows that tree plantation, restoration, afforestation, all of these things that involve planting trees in the ground has become a very prominent global discourse, and ever more prominent in recent years. You can see that in some recent publications. This article in Nature from a couple of years ago says, how do we plant 1 trillion trees? Not 1 billion, but 1 trillion. And then this very controversial article from this summer, the global tree restoration potential, says, well, maybe we can increase global tree cover 25% or so. These are really grand claims, and what is missing from these debates actually is what is going to happen to the people that live in these landscapes, many of whom across the developing world are very poor. They have insecure tenure, they rely heavily on local natural resources, and they don't really know what their political rights are, much less have the ability to exercise them. So that's the first thing that is being overlooked. The second thing that is being overlooked is actually we act like this is new, but tree plantations, large-scale tree plantations, have been going on for decades around the world, and so we have much to learn about that. So that's what we're trying to do, is to learn from that in this project, Impacts of Afforestation on Sustainable Rural Livelihoods in India, which is funded by NASA Land Use Land Cover Change Grant. And what we're doing is connecting satellite imagery analysis with Forest Department plantation records for the past 4 decades, large-scale data collection of 2,400 households and quite a few plantations, and in-depth qualitative inquiry to try to understand how does planting trees actually affect rural, resource-dependent people in the developing world. Now, we just finalized our data collection effort, and we haven't actually done enough of the analysis to be able to give you conclusive findings, but I'm going to summarize a few things. So, if you look at tree plantation records in the state of Himachal Pradesh in North India where we are working, actually it has declined since the 1980s. So once again, we act like this is new, but it's really not. And what we have in this area is sort of a patchwork of trees across the landscape of different species, of different ages, and with very different impacts to the people that live there. So we see a diversity of impacts. There are positive impacts. Sometimes people get new sources of fuelwood. Sometimes they get new sources of leaf fodder from tree plantations. But if you look at the balance of things, actually, we're seeing far more negative than is positive. So the biggest thing we're seeing actually is the conversion of common grazing land, which people use to graze their animals, to other forms of land use where they cannot graze their animals anymore. This is a big strain on local livelihoods. But there's other things as well, like fires, invasive species that follow plantations, and other things that are really very negative to the people that live there. A lot depends on what kind of species are being planted. However, historically at least, you can see that the Forest Department has favored large-scale monoculture plantations that really are not fast-growing trees that are really actually exacerbating the kinds of negative impacts. So it's not just that the immediate effect of a tree plantation on a livelihood. Actually, planting trees can ripple through a livelihood system. So for example, some of the patterns we have seen. Conversion of village common grazing land means you have less fodder. If you have less fodder, often you have to purchase more fodder. If you purchase more fodder, that means that keeping livestock is more expensive. If keeping livestock is more expensive, you may choose to keep fewer livestock over time. But if you keep fewer livestock, actually you lose your draft power, you lose your manure, you're going to have to actually purchase more chemical fertilizer, and over time you may choose to gravitate towards off-farm employment instead of subsistence agriculture. Now, I don't want to pretend like planting trees is the one thing that is changing livelihood systems. There's lots of things that are changing livelihood systems in this area. But for a certain subsection of society, particularly the poor and marginal, who are highly dependent on grazing area, this actually does appear to be a major influential factor. So the final thing is, well, is there a possibility for win-win outcomes? Is planting trees necessarily bad? Well, actually, we do see that sometimes people struggle against the Forest Department. Sometimes the Forest Department does actually collaborate with communities to influence tree plantations, particularly where they feel that they're going to face lots of pressure. And that over time, we do think that the Forest Department is becoming increasingly attentive to community needs in plantations. So that's the good news. Yes, there probably is a possibility for win-win outcome. But I want to close with this. Let's be honest. This is not the norm, and it's not likely to be the norm across much of the developing world. So there is a real risk that we're going to face large-scale negative consequences for many people.
Yes, my name is Åsa Kasimir. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Earth Sciences, University of Gothenburg. So I will talk about drained organic soils, a global hotspot of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think we need to highlight the peatlands since they store twice as much carbon as the forests. as the world's forest. And this is due to the wet conditions when the plant remains are only partly decomposed, accumulating and storing peat in these soils. But when we drain these for agriculture or forestry reasons, the oxygen comes into this anoxic peat and increases the decomposition of the peat, releasing carbon dioxide and also nitrous oxide, D-nitric oxide. And these soils are hotspots for greenhouse gas emissions. So 2 gigatons, which can be compared with 53 totally for the human emissions. And then we have the Southeast Asia as a hotspot. And these are the drained soils, earlier being forests, deforested, and now planted with oil palm. They are biologically decomposed by this more oxygen in the soil, but also easily burning, so they cause a lot of air pollution in the area. We have Russia and we have EU as hotspots. It's for drained agriculture soils and forestry. And in Sweden, it looks small, these numbers, but for Swedish conditions, it's 10 megatons from the drained organic soils, forestry and agriculture. It's only a few % of the forest land, so it's not much area, but a hotspot. So this could be compared with the road traffic emissions, 10 to 17. So it cannot be ignored. So how should we mitigate these emissions? So we did this scenario study based on data collected in Skogaryd, which is a research site between Uddevalla and Vänersborg, where it was a spruce forest with a water table half a meter down into the soil. It has a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and then we did this scenario modeling showing that re-wetting and a changed vegetation could linearly decrease the carbon dioxide emissions. But besides carbon dioxide, it's also nitrous oxide emissions which are mitigated. But for the wetland case, we have a lot of methane emissions. So there are much unknowns still, and we are now in Skogaryd starting a restoration experiment. The forest was clear-cut this summer, and now it looks like this. And this winter, there will be a barrier built across the valley, re-wetting half the area, so the water level will stay just below the soil surface. And half the area will be replanted with spruce and still drained. And so we have the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and we also have the World Wetlands Day, the 2nd February. It's a Sunday, and we want to invite you all and for an open excursion at Skogaryd to celebrate this day and have a workshop on the Monday after to discuss mitigation options, policy incentives, and actions. So I want to invite a broad amount of people from society also. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about 2 projects that are ongoing at IVL that I work with at the moment. First one is called Blue Green City Lab, which is a project down in Malmö, city of Malmö in the southern part of Sweden, where we're working with urban sustainable development across the city landscape. The second project is called Mr. Digital Forest, where we work with different forest companies and other research organizations with digitalization in the forestry sector, Swedish forestry sector. I don't have any results to share from these projects yet, so I will just go through aims and planned work that is to be done. Yeah, and compared to many or the rest of the other projects that is presented here, these are confined to Sweden. But I think it could be interesting to share these issues in different geographical contexts and perspectives, and hopefully we can interesting comparison could be made with other countries in a few years' time when these projects are going to be completed. Right, so like Maria mentioned, and we heard this in the morning, yeah, I was very happy to be part of Focali during the first few years when it all started. I was a doctoral student at the University of Gothenburg at the time, and doing research on forest carbon stocks and plus. So it was a great opportunity that Focali started during this time, and provided a very interesting arena to have interesting discussions with other researchers and to have an opportunity to share results with others, and to get to know other stakeholders working within these fields. And it was also very valuable to be able to publish research in more easily digestive formats like policy briefs and reports, as can be seen here. Out of, what did we hear, 62 reports, first three years, something like that. Yeah, so just 3 examples here. Right, so going back to the present then, we work with a project at the moment down in Malmö called Blue Green City Lab, which is a Vinnova-funded testbed with the goal to enhance and raise interest in the use of green-blue products or nature-based solutions in the city landscape. So the aim of this project is that producers and companies, for example real estate companies, can test and verify the performance of their products by independent experts. And in this case, IVL are the experts together with SLU here. So we evaluate the hydrological and green functions together with SLU on, for example, vertical gardens. It could be innovative systems for urban gardening, for example. So right now we are about to start our first evaluation and test within this project. So next week we are going to install sensors and loggers on a number of vertical gardens, as you can see here, that are located on 2 different parking houses around the city. So that will be very interesting to when we next spring and summer we're going to start the evaluation of this data. So that will be interesting to see the actual benefits of this these walls, if they are making any difference or not. Another project, slightly different project, is called the Mr. Digital Forest, and it deals with how to digitalize the forestry sector in the way that the forest can be used more efficiently and gently by integrating information flows across the whole value chain. So it's a very big program that is running for 4 years together with large forestry companies and with other research organizations. So our part in this is to develop and apply tools for visualizing and communicating the sustainability of the forests for future scenarios. And we will also develop indicators for measuring biological diversity and ecosystem services in the Swedish forests. Yeah, so that's short on this program. Just finally, I will just say that I hope on the long-term basis, I'm hoping to be able to work more with international research projects at the IVL, and we have some interesting research projects coming up here with Madelene and other studies. So thank you.
Thank you. So, so my name is Mauricio Sagastuy. This is Charlie Horsnell. He is on the board also of the Agroforestry Center, and we wrote this SIANI expert group, this project together. So, our name is Empowering Women in Uganda through Agroforestry. Super shortly, what the Agroforestry Center is like we are an NGO working with creating an agroforest system in a grassland here in Gothenburg, in Angered. And we work with ecotourism also, social integration of immigrants that come to Sweden. And super important, this building bridges between Sweden and East Africa, because the founders of Agroforestry Center, one is Esther, she's in the back. She's from Ethiopia, and the other woman is called Sarah, she's from Uganda. So the goal is to build bridges between Sweden and East Africa. But now I'm just going to talk about the SIANI expert group. So we already got accepted from SIANI to start this project. And it's we're going to work in the Kalokola parish in Uganda. So and the NGO that we're going to work there with is the Agroforestry Recreation Center Uganda. This NGO works with like technical assistance, focus on women. So technical assistance programs in agroforestry to empower people that with low income, again, especially women, to work with agroforestry, get an income and protect nature at the same time. So, I mean, I haven't listed now exactly who the partners will be, because we are still building these partners to know exactly who it is going to be. But in general, it's a group of Swedish and Ugandan researchers, Swedish and Ugandan NGOs, public officials in Uganda, and private actors in Uganda. To say some examples, I mean, we're thinking of collaborating like with V. Skogen, actually with Eskil, we may collaborate also there with IVL, and we are getting in contact with some researchers also in Focali. Also, if you're interested, you can come talk to us later if you want to be part of this project or contribute in some way. But I didn't explain what the project is, but so this is, I mean, this is a really short presentation. So we have 3 goals in this project. First is like, expand, as I said, expand an agroforestry technical assistance program to 8 adjacent villages. So the NGO that I named at the beginning, they have already showed, like, they're already working successfully, training people to work with agroforestry in the village, this really small village called Kipsi village. And they have, around this area, that has shown a lot of interest in her workshops, and many farmers, again, especially women, are implementing these agroforestry practices, but they don't have the funds to expand it to make it bigger. So we want to expand it to 8 like adjacent villages to train more people to work with agroforestry. The second is like make research about the development of the program. So, I mean, we have talked a lot about this today, you know, like research, like, okay, how can we make research more like applicable, you know, and so we want to see like how well does these programs function for like adoption of agroforestry for small-scale farmers. And the last one, and this is like super important, is like create and expand networks between Sweden and Uganda, and in Uganda, especially in Uganda. So, for example, like SIANI proposed us, there are some platforms where different farmers can get in touch with more farmers in, for example, in Africa and East Africa, to learn even more about sustainable farming practices. We want to link farmers with like public officials or with extensionists. So we want to create and expand networks. And also a part of this program is we aim at inviting public officials to these workshops, so they can also see how it's being done, and so we can also impact on the policy level in Uganda. Exactly. And yeah, so if you're interested in the project, I mean, Mauricio, Charlie, you can email us, and we're gonna be today here and in the dinner. So really, everybody like researchers or like actually we thought also talking with ICRAF and so on. Everybody that is interested, like dissemination of information or do some kind of research or just contribute to the project, you are more than welcome to talk to us. Yeah.
Yes, hi. I'm a visiting research fellow at the unit of human geography here at the university, where I belong to a group of other researchers we are interested in issues related to the question of how to improve the rights to land and other resources, with particular focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Say that over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been some new types of tenure reforms that are being introduced, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a complex background to this, and I've listed some of the factors behind this interest. And perhaps one of the most important is that the conventional approach of providing property rights to land and resources has usually been through individual ownership titling. As we know it here in Europe, it's a freehold ownership to land, which is private ownership to land. Now, this approach has been tried in several African countries over the years, but the results have not really been very successful for a number of reasons. So the fact is that on the African continent, about 90% of all land is still not registered in terms of ownership rights. And the fact that this, at the same time as there's an increasing demand and competition for land, we've all heard about it now for a number of reasons. There are large-scale commercial investment interest, this population growth within the continent, which is provoking increased competition for land, conflicts over land, etc. And this situation there is a search for new approaches to securing land rights. And hence we're talking about the new generation of land tenure reforms. So our research interest as a group is particularly to analyze the experiences and lessons learned from this type of new generation of reforms. Now, how do I do this? Yes. Just some of the salient features of this new approach. In general sense, the ambition, at least in the discourse of these new approaches, is that there is a need for an approach which is better adapted to local conditions. It's a need for an approach which is less expensive to undertake, like individual land titling. And specifically, these new approaches, which is a kind of a common threads, there are 3 criteria I'm listed here which I think are important. One is that it seeks to formalize rights to land based on existing customary tenure principles and procedures. I mean, of these 90% of land which is still not registered, about 80% of that land, of course, has its owners. But these ownerships are regulated through customary principles and procedures which are not formalized. Now, these new approaches, in different ways, try to build on the existence of these customary principles and procedures and rather formalize those, build rights upon those. Another characteristic is that it seeks to legalize this customary village, the community or village as a communal landholding unit. So instead of going directly at the individual level, one tries to legalize rights at the group level, which could be a community or could be a village, varies between countries. The third feature, which is interesting, is that it integrates all types of land, individual as well as common properties, such as forests, under the same tenure regime. They are not separate. There is not one tenure regime for forest, another one for agricultural land. From the community point of view, it's one tenure system, which regulates the rights of access to these resources. Some of the countries that have adopted elements or variants of this approach are listed here. There's Tanzania, Mozambique, Liberia, Burkina Faso, and most recently Kenya, in fact, which is in its new land policy. So introducing a variant of this type of approach. South Sudan has also been mentioned. I think there are, you could put Uganda, I think, also in this category. Implementation varies from one country to another. I would say that Tanzania and Mozambique are probably the ones which are most advanced in implementing this type of approach. So the purpose of our research is to draw policy-relevant lessons and conclusions from the implementation of this approach on the ground. So we do field work, try to, together with villages and communities, to find out what are their experiences, what are the issues, what are the advantages, what are the problems with this approach when it's being implemented at a local level. So we try to find out that in a dialogue with the affected or the involved populations themselves. And so far our research is primarily focusing on Tanzania and Mozambique. A couple of publications, if you are interested in learning more, I've listed 2 working papers of myself here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. So I'm going to answer the question why seaweed gets involved in resilient landscapes. And first of all, a few words about SIWI, Stockholm International Water Institute. We work with bridging science, policy and practice for a water-wise world, and we do this through awarding Stockholm Water Prizes. We organize the World Water Week every summer. We have a project office with projects in different parts of the world focusing on water resources, management and governance. And we have Swedish Waterhouse that I'm from, and we promote dialogue and collaboration with Swedish stakeholders on emerging water issues through seminars. I mentioned World Water Week, we have World Water Day, and we have something called cluster groups. Does this work? No? No, it doesn't. No, I wanted to point. Okay, doesn't matter. You can read here. We have cluster groups where we bring together experts from different sectors and different fields to discuss emerging water issues and come up with some recommendations for future action. We also try to link this to international policy processes. We have a special division for that, and the focus is very much now on climate change policy. And also I mentioned these stakeholder groups. Background is that we have coordinated multi-stakeholder platforms or cluster groups on water, forest and landscapes since 2013, when we started collaborating with Focali for the first time. And we have organized events annually at the World Water Week since 2015, also together with Focali, and published a number of reports, scientific articles and policy briefs. You can see copies there. I can't point, it doesn't seem to work. Yes, it does. And we also have some copies here at the back. And we are contributing also to some other international processes and reports. This is just an example of one of our latest reports. I wanted to show the Focali logo here. And we have Ida and others also that have contributed to this report. So we find Focali a very useful network of experts that help us to explore these water issues. And this was about water for productive and multi-functional landscapes. We also coordinate an international group of experts that is called the Forest Water Champions. That was established in 2017 together with FAU and IUCN. And this was to identify areas of agreement and disagreement related to the forest water nexus and its management. Again, here we have produced some reports, policy briefs. We have also collaborated with IUFRO, that you probably know more about than I do, the International Union for Forest Research Organizations, that invited us to organize a policy session at their joint forest water conference last year in Chile. We have contributed also to the climate change process, UNFCCC. Last year, we developed a Talanoa dialogue, which was kind of stakeholder dialogue, a formalized format for that, and submitted to the UNFCCC and participated in COP24 in Katowice, and were part of a number of events to put water on the climate change agenda in the context of agriculture and forestry. We are also planning to attend COP25 this year, although there have been some complications recently that you may have heard about, but we're still hopeful that we will be involved in a number of events where we can promote our work, conclusions and report. And you can see at the bottom here also a depiction of the kind of water flows in the landscape that we are discussing in this group, where forests and trees play a very important role in the landscape. Okay, good. I've come to my last slide almost. CIWI's overarching goal is actually to promote good water governance, and we focus on landscapes in this case, where we work with source-to-sea governance frameworks, trying to link critical flows from terrestrial ecosystems in upstream areas, often forests, the whole way through the freshwater system, coastal areas, out into the oceans. This involves flows of sediments, biota, could also be plastic. Yeah, linked to multi-level governance, public participation, and finally private sector engagement. And we have a special tool for that. So I hope this explained why we engage in this work on resilient landscapes, because the water plays a very important role. Thank you.
All right, this is going to be a challenge because I thought I had 15 minutes, but okay. Here's the book. I'm going to talk about it, how it came about, and how it now entered here. I'm part of another big program called Agri4C, which deals with food security. And I'm not going to talk that much about it, but I'm heading a theme called multifunctional landscapes within this theme. And multifunctional landscape, as we have defined it, is something that you have the aim, you produce, you're managing with the aim to produce more than one product or service. In 2017, we had a course in Nairobi, and we had one day together with Mine van Noordwijk, that you might know if you're in agroforestry circles. He had, together with me and 15 African researchers, a day. And it turned out that they were very frustrated that there was a lack of good African examples. And all of these people felt that they were sitting on these examples, but they are never talked about, they are never disseminated. So that was the kind of the start of this book. And here are the 6 authors of the book. And to the right there is actually one of the members of IDA's, where IDA and you and everyone has been in Burkina Faso. He's the father of this parkland place in Sapone, south of Ouagadougou. Anyway, when we started this, it turned out that it was a big job. So I called my friend, my good old friend, Elisabeth Simelton, and she came in, and she was also the co-editor of this book. Thank God. So it turned out to be a book. The reason is that in Africa, this is a picture that you might know, that when it comes to food production, and here we have maize, millet, and sorghum and rice, Africa is not following the pattern that we see, for example, in Asia or in Latin America or in other parts of the world. So they have a challenge, indeed, when it comes to food security in the future. All right, very quickly, these 6 cases. We have the parklands in Burkina Faso, where Ida was also talking about her optimum place. She actually had a place right in this picture where she actually measured these infiltration measures. So what does the parkland produce here? They have integrated crop and food production where they have trees that give a multiple of products, but also this service of infiltrating water. Also, a lot of these trees are shea trees that produces shea oil, which is a women product. So it has a gender thing included here that Josiah is presenting in the book. Maize-based systems in Nigeria, where they actually intercrop with maize. And Nigeria is the main producer and exporter of maize in Africa. And a large percentage of the maize is intercropped in Nigeria. Who knew that? No one probably, but it's a good thing. So this makes it more drought tolerant, diversified diets, and also an income security for the people who produces it. Also from Nigeria, a peri-urban agriculture case where they have also, this is on talking about 10-year problems here, but at least they produce food for this year or whatever level they have to deal with. Diversified food. Home incomes for households. We have in Ethiopia a case of integrated watershed management where very costly, but they have done a lot of good job when it comes to terracing, diversified food. Women don't have to walk that far because they have water harvesting in the watershed. And then we have fish farming in Kenya, where they actually introduce fish into the agriculture systems. It can be done in a very small scale and also a very large, more industrial way. But what Geraldine is trying to show here is that it can be modified depending on where you are. She even have cases from very dry parts of Kenya where this actually works. And then we have another case from Nigeria on climate smart agriculture. And I would like to say that this book is available open access. And I'd like to keep you on a string because Elisabeth and I are doing some educational material going with the book that is coming soon. All right?
Okay. Yeah.
Hi. My master's project, okay, these are all the people involved, but we're basically interested in looking at what are some solution-based things we can understand about looking at supply chain data and understanding global biodiversity. So we're in the early phases of the project. I'm going to show you some of the details about the metrics. But pretty much the number one driver of biodiversity loss that the EPA's study came out with this year is change in land and sea use. So we're really interested in understanding that and our consumption patterns. In terms of land and sea use, according to IPCC, 69% of Earth's land is appropriated by humans for agriculture and timber production. Particularly large is the pasture lands section of that. So we're looking into supply chain data in particular to understand what are the outcomes of this land and how does our appropriation of the land lead to biodiversity loss. So I like to think, I'm actually a systematics student, and I like to compare how the supply chain data works. The past 10 years, it's kind of like analogous to genetic data, where bioinformaticians have been taking genetic data and coding and understanding a lot more, making a lot more inferences from that. We're kind of doing the same thing in the past 10 years in this space with the supply chain data. It's being environmentally extended for people to make a lot of understandings and connections about how our consumption is impacting global biodiversity. This study is one of the co-authors on the paper, and he looked at how United States consumption is impacting biodiversity hotspots. And so we're going to take this data, come up with a list that we then create solutions from. And so this is kind of my more technical slide. There's actually, the FAO has interfaces that you can search and find all of this data. Interesting to the forest people are probably what does timber turn into? What are the production methods from that? And there's a lot of different supply chain data types out there. What are the best ones? And how can we use this data to come up with solutions? So I am interested if anybody wants to chat, has used this data before. I think a lot of the supply chain people are actually in the other talk. But yeah, that's where we're at. And then we can basically be able to compare the land use footprint to drinking a cup of coffee, to using your paper towels, and understand what are solutions that we can suggest to people in a systematic way. Cool.
I don't know how many of you guys recognize Douglas Adams. I hope that you have all read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah? And know that the take-home message from that is don't panic, and then also 42, but I'm not going to get into that. So I want to talk a bit about biodiversity research, because as Maria said, I'm the director of the Gothenburg Global Biodiversity Center. And we are quite similar to Focali in a lot of ways, and that's one of the things I really enjoy being on the Secretariat, because I get to see a lot of the parallels that are going on between our organizations. Yes. So my passion and my agenda is biodiversity. And that means that I was really happy in the spring when the EPIS report came out, the EPIS Summary for Policymakers. And that's basically the biodiversity version of the IPCC. And what the EPIS report said, well, it said many things, but it basically was able to put a lot of the information that we had floating around together into one package for policymakers for people to make decisions based on. And this is extremely important, because it's one thing to have information, but it's another thing to actually take it forward and do something with it. So we need to be thinking about both sides of this problem. As Louisa was already saying, one of the most important outcomes we had for the EPIS report, or that the EPIS report had, was that the biggest threat to biodiversity loss is changes in land and sea use. Next is direct exploitation, and number 3 is climate change. So climate change is a huge thing on the agenda right now, as it should be. But it's not actually the biggest threat to biodiversity. There are different threats to biodiversity. Many of them overlap, but they're not the exact same thing as climate change. So my call right now is to basically think about biodiversity and consider this, in addition to climate change, as something that is important going into the future and in our research. I guess you guys have seen these a few times today as well. Once or twice. The Sustainable Development Goals. Instead of presented in the nice 17 boxes, I like this presentation a little bit more because it shows how they're layered and how they refer back to each other. And I think that it really focuses on the fact that the SDGs don't stand alone. And it's really nice that in Sweden the funding is starting to show that as well. There are now calls for different projects that combine Sustainable Development Goals, both the pluses and the minuses, how they affect each other. So biodiversity is not a standalone issue. It's something that basically we can't stand alone either. It's something that we need to think about in a bigger picture together. So the Gothenburg Global Biodiversity Center, we're trying to do just this. We have partners both at the universities and public partners from around Western Sweden. And our goal is to bring a bunch of people working with biodiversity in different ways together so that we can have a bigger impact on biodiversity research and policy. So I think my main take-home message right now is a rah-rah for organizations like the center and like Focali, where people are actually able to come, talk to each other, get bigger ideas, have bigger impacts, and really, find the strength in our numbers. So don't forget biodiversity and work together. And quickly go through this. Douglas Adams, the guy who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide, he also wrote this book, Last Chance to See. He was actually really, really into biodiversity.
I had a friend who sat next to him on an airplane once, and she wanted to talk to him because he's awesome, and he didn't want to talk about himself at all. He wanted to hear about her because she was a biologist. I think it's so cool. So he wrote this book actually 20 years ago now, going around and looking at some critically endangered species. So it's something that people have been aware of for quite a while, but we haven't actually got our act together in order to actually get policies passed that are going to protect biodiversity. There's a lot of work being done, but we have a lot of work to go. And so I would encourage people to think about what impact they want to make. Who is your target audience? Researchers rarely think about that, I think. Who is our target audience? What do we want to get done? And then are we keeping them in mind? And with that, thank you. Now we can do some coffee.